He had once crowned himself emperor before the Pope. He had redrawn the borders of Europe with pen and cannon. But in the bitter spring of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte sat on a bench outside Fontainebleau, head in his hands, utterly alone. His empire lay in ruins, and Paris's capital had opened its gates to the enemy. And yet, even in defeat, one question refused to die. Was it all inevitable, or did he throw away the world? This is not a story of a meteoric rise, nor is it merely a tale of one man's fall. It is the chronicle of a final gamble, Napoleon's 1814 campaign to defend France itself against impossible odds. It was a campaign of miracles and missteps, of betrayal and brilliance. It was the moment when Europe turned against its conqueror and the empire buckled beneath the weight of ambition. But how did a man who had once ruled from Madrid to Moscow find himself scrambling through the snows of Champagne, with conscript boys at his side and enemies at every border? And what did his choices at the gates of Paris and the edge of despair reveal about the nature of power, loyalty, and the thin line between genius and ruin? The year was 1813. The winds of change were howling across Europe. The Battle of Leipzig, known to history as the Battle of the Nations, had been a catastrophe. In October of that year, Napoleon suffered the heaviest defeat of his career. His armies, once invincible, had been crushed by the combined might of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. What remained of the once grand French forces limped westward, back toward the Rhine, retreating into their homeland for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The world Napoleon had reshaped was collapsing. But even in the aftermath of disaster, there was still a chance, a moment of grace. In November, the coalition, emboldened but not yet merciless, offered Napoleon the Frankfurt proposals. It was a generous peace by the standards of war. Napoleon could remain emperor, France could keep her throne, if only he would abandon his conquests and withdraw to her so-called natural frontiers. France would retain the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. It was, many historians agree, the best offer Napoleon would ever receive. And yet, he hesitated. He had not yet given up the dream, not yet let go of Belgium, the Netherlands, or the lands of the Rhineland. He delayed. Negotiations stalled. His silence was interpreted as defiance. By January 1814, the opportunity was gone. The Sixth Coalition no longer offered terms. Now they came with armies. The Allies crossed the Rhine and entered French soil. Across the empire, the situation crumbled. Besieged French garrisons in the east were falling one by one. Marshal Davout, the Iron Marshal, still held out with 34,000 men in Hamburg, but he was now isolated. Denmark, one of Napoleon's last allies, was forced to surrender under pressure from Bernadotte, Crown Prince of Sweden, and one of Napoleon's former marshals. In Italy, Murat, Napoleon's own brother-in-law turned traitor, signing a secret alliance with the coalition and marching his Neapolitan army north against the French. In Spain, the situation was equally dire. Napoleon agreed to release King Ferdinand VII, the Bourbon monarch, in a last-ditch attempt to secure peace. But the move had little effect. Wellington continued to advance. France was losing ground everywhere. Back in Paris, the crisis triggered desperate measures. Taxes were doubled, state salaries and pensions suspended. A levy of 300,000 new conscripts was issued, pulling into service a generation barely old enough to hold a musket. Napoleon's grip was slipping, and yet he would not go quietly. On the 25th of January, 1814, Napoleon departed the Tuileries Palace. He said farewell to his wife, Marie-Louise, and his 3-year-old son, the King of Rome. He would never see them again. He rode to the front with an army of barely 70,000 men-raw recruits, many in peasant clothes, most still untrained. Facing him were more than 250,000 Allied troops, organized into 2 major armies, Blücher's Army of Silesia in the north and Schwarzenberg's Army of Bohemia in the south. It was an impossible situation, and yet, in the impossibility, Napoleon found freedom. For the first time in years, his army was small enough for him to command every element directly. No delays, no hesitant subordinates, just speed, audacity, and his own brilliance. The terrain he would fight over was the heart of France-Champagne, a region of flat fields, frost-covered villages, and narrow muddy roads that twisted through frozen rivers like the Marne and the Seine. The land itself seemed hostile, and yet Napoleon would use it like a chessboard. He struck first at Brienne, near the military academy, where he had trained as a boy, his target, part of Blücher's scattered forces. The fighting was brutal. Snow swirled in the air as French and Prussian forces collided. Napoleon's cavalry was nearly overwhelmed, and the emperor himself was almost skewered by a charging Cossack saved only by the quick trigger of General Gourgaud. The Allies pulled back. The first blow had landed, but the enemy learned quickly. Just days later, Blücher and Schwarzenberg combined their forces and launched a surprise assault at La Rothière. The battle was punishing. Over 5,000 French casualties. 73 cannons lost in the thick mud. The Allies had learned to fight together, and now, for the first time, they had defeated Napoleon on French soil. It seemed the campaign might end before it began. But then came their mistake. Believing Napoleon was in retreat, the Allies divided their forces again. Blücher in the north along the Marne, Schwarzenberg in the south along the Seine. It was the very error Napoleon had hoped for. He moved fast. Leaving just enough troops to shadow Schwarzenberg, he turned north with 30,000 men, aiming to destroy Blücher's army of Silesia before it could regroup. What followed would become known as the 6 days Campania feat of maneuver warfare, so bold that even his enemies would later stand in awe. At Champaubert, Napoleon fell upon General Osifyev's isolated Russian corps and crushed it, capturing the general and taking 2,000 prisoners. The next day, he stormed onto Montmirail, engaging Sacken's corps before York's Prussians could reinforce. The old guard veterans of Austerlitz and Genouer thrown into the fray. By nightfall, Napoleon had inflicted over 3,500 casualties. The Allies began to panic. He chased them through the fields, harrying their rear guard at Château Thierry. Mortier and MacDonald rebuilt bridges that had been torched. Every time the Allies thought they had escaped, the French were back at their heels. At Vauchamp, he cornered Blücher's remaining forces, crushing them with flanking cavalry attacks. In 6 days, he had won 4 major battles, captured thousands, and scattered an army twice his size. He was outnumbered, undersupplied, and outgunned, but he had found something he had not felt since the glory days of Italy: momentum. And yet, momentum alone could not change the fate of empires. Even as the fields of Champagne echoed with cannon fire and the smell of black powder, Napoleon's victories rang hollow in many ears. In Paris and across France, the old fervor was gone. These were not the levy en masse days of 1793, nor the triumphal years of Marengo and Austerlitz. France was tired of war, of death, of uncertainty. The nation that had once marched under the tricolor in a blaze of revolutionary fervor now stared into the abyss. Napoleon, too, had changed. Gone was the idealistic general who spoke of liberty and brotherhood. What remained was a man obsessed with the preservation of power his own and that of a crumbling empire. But his mind remained unmatched. While the Allied high command bickered over strategy and moved with ponderous caution, Napoleon read their intentions like an open book. After his success against Blücher, Napoleon wheeled south to confront Schwarzenberg's advance along the Seine. At Mormant, his forces routed the Austrian vanguard. At Montmirail, he personally directed artillery fire and repulsed the Allied Verburg Corps, inflicting 30% casualties. His energy was astounding. Covering over 60 miles in a matter of days, through sleet and slush, he pushed his ragtag army to the limit. Officers who had once doubted now followed him with renewed faith. But as one front fell back, the other always threatened. While Napoleon drove the Bohemians east, Blücher was regrouping again in the north. The Allies, chastened by their defeat in Champagne, had come to a fateful conclusion. They would no longer chase Napoleon, they would go around him. At Chaumont, on the 1st of March, 1814, the 4 great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, signed a secret treaty. They pledged to keep 150,000 troops each in the field until Napoleon was defeated. There would be no separate peace, no wavering. The mistakes of past coalitions would not be repeated. Napoleon's last hope that he might divide and conquer through diplomacy evaporated. To make matters worse, British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh secured another powerful incentive, a £5 million subsidy to be shared among the Allies. Money, men, and will the Allied cause was now united as never before. And while Napoleon's armies marched, Paris began to fracture. Across the country, cities surrendered without resistance. Dijon, Lyon, Bordeaux. In Bordeaux, the mayor rode out with a white Bourbon cockade pinned to his chest to welcome the approaching British. The revolution, it seemed, had come full circle. Napoleon's gamble had won him glory in Champagne, but it had not saved the empire. The Allies were bleeding, but they were not broken. And Paris, the heart of France, was now in their sights. In mid-March, Napoleon turned again toward the north. Blucher was marching on Paris, gathering reinforcements, and exploiting every moment that Napoleon was distracted elsewhere. Once again, the emperor raced across terrible roads, covering 60 miles in 3 days, hoping to intercept and crush Blucher before he could reach the capital. It was an old tactic: rapid movement, divide and destroy. At Reims, he achieved a stunning success. The Russian general Saint Priest had just taken the city, but Napoleon's assault was swift and brutal. The city was retaken, Saint Priest mortally wounded, and his corps scattered. But these victories had diminishing returns. By the time Napoleon reached Laon, Blucher had concentrated his army, 98,000 men, twice the size of Napoleon's exhausted force. Worse, the French emperor believed he faced only a rear guard. The error proved costly. Laon was a disaster. French attacks were repelled. Marshal Ney's corps was routed. Napoleon's army suffered over 6,500 casualties, many of them elite veterans. Blucher, ironically, was ill at the time and hesitated to press the advantage. But the damage was done. Napoleon now realized he could not win a war of attrition. Every man he lost was irreplaceable. The levies had dried up. The treasury was empty. France's fields were bare. Still he fought on. In late March, he made one last great but audacious plan to strike into the Allied rear, unite with isolated garrisons, and force the enemy to pull back from Paris. The idea was brilliant. The execution was flawed, because even as he turned east toward Saint-Dizier, a shadow was moving behind Himone that would seal his fate. In Paris, a man named Charles Maurice de Talleyrand watched and waited. He had once been Napoleon's foreign minister. Now, he was his silent executioner. Talleyrand wrote to the Russian Emperor, Alexander I, urging the Allies to ignore Napoleon's distractions and strike directly at Paris. The time, he insisted, was now. The capital's defenses were neglected. The mood was turning. Talleyrand was not alone. The Allies had intercepted a letter from Napoleon's own police chief, General Savary. It was a damning assessment. The treasury, the arsenals, and the powder stores are empty. We are completely at the end of our resources. The population is discouraged and discontented, wishing peace at any price. On the 30th of March, 1814, the coalition armies 120,000 strong assaulted Paris. Inside the city, Marshal Marmont and Mortier commanded a fragile defense, 37,000 troops, one-third of whom were untrained National Guards. But they fought. House to house, street to street, they held back the tide. By nightfall, they could fight no more. To save Paris from destruction, Marmont surrendered the city. He secured terms allowing the garrison to march out with weapons and dignity, but the war was over. At the Hôtel des Invalides, Marshal Serrurier, 71 years old, oversaw the burning of captured enemy flags and Frederick the Great's sword, so they would not fall into Allied hands. Just 15 miles away, at Fontainebleau, Napoleon received the news. He sat, silent, for 15 minutes, his head in his hands. A had lost Paris. The fall of Paris was more than a military defeat. It was a political and psychological rupturia wound that sliced through the very identity of the Napoleonic state. For the first time since the 100 Years' War, foreign soldiers stood in the heart of France. Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées. Austrian grenadiers occupied the left bank. The city that had once inspired the storming of the Bastille now bowed its head to monarchs crowned in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. And for Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe with a pen and a bayonet, the betrayal ran deepest not on the battlefield, but in the marble halls of Fontainebleau. There, in his ancestral palace, the emperor gathered his marshals. They had followed him across continents. They had won and lost empires in his name. Now, they told him the truth he refused to see. The war was over. France would not rise for him again. He accused them of cowardice, of treachery. But they did not flinch. Marshal Ney, same Ney who had wept before the Tsar at the Beresina, who had commanded the rear guard from Moscow, stood before his emperor and said, "The army will not follow you, sire. France desires peace." Napoleon offered to abdicate in favor of his son, the King of Rome. The Allies rejected it. On the 6th of April, 1814, Napoleon abdicated unconditionally. In his formal declaration he wrote, "The Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces, for himself and his heirs, the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, even that of life itself, which he is not ready to make in the interests of France." The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed shortly thereafter, allowed him to retain his imperial title, sovereignty over the small island of Elba, and a personal guard of 400 men. For a man who once ruled more than half of Europe, it was a bitter retreat into irrelevance. On the 20th of April, 1814, Napoleon assembled the imperial guard in the courtyard of the Château de Fontainebleau. The men stood in silent formation. Many were hardened veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram. They had followed their general across frozen plains and burning deserts. Now, they watched as the greatest soldier of their time prepared to leave them. Napoleon stood before them, dressed in the familiar gray greatcoat, his bicorn under one arm. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of finality. "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years, I have accompanied you on the road to honor and glory. France has become accustomed to seeing you on the battlefield. Do not regret my fate. If I have consented to survive, it is to serve your glory. I would embrace you all, but I will kiss your flag." He stepped forward and pressed his lips to the eagle standard of the guard. Many soldiers wept. Some broke ranks and rushed to him, kneeling before the man who had become legend. Then he turned and walked away. His carriage rolled toward the Mediterranean, toward Elba, toward exile. In the months that followed, France reshaped itself. The Bourbon monarchy returned, with Louis XVIII installed by Allied bayonets. France's borders were rolled back to those of 1792. The tricolor vanished, replaced by the white flag of the ancient regime. And Europe, exhausted and scorched by years of total war, began the long, delicate work of diplomacy. At the Congress of Vienna, old dynasties reclaimed their thrones. New lines were drawn. A balance of power was drafted not with ideals, but with ink, maps, and mistrust. And yet, the shadow of Napoleon loomed over every decision. 2 to 3 million lives had been lost during the Napoleonic Wars. Of those, the vast majority died not in combat, but of disease, hunger, or exposure. Whole regions had been depopulated, families shattered, economies crippled. For many across Europe, the end of the war brought relief, but also a question. Had it all been worth it? Had one man's dream of empire, of glory, of legacy justified so much death? Some said yes, that Napoleon had brought modernity, abolished feudalism, spread the Napoleonic code, and shattered stagnant monarchies. Others saw only a tyrant, cloaked in republican language, who crowned himself emperor and bathed Europe in blood. But history rarely speaks in absolutes. Napoleon Bonaparte was a paradoxal revolutionary who became an autocrat, a liberator who conquered nations, a genius who ultimately undid himself. He had marched from the burning sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia. He had defied popes, humbled kings, and crowned himself above all. And yet, he fell not by a blade to the heart, or a thunderous defeat, but by exhaustion, both his and his country's, by lies. But if Napoleon's story had ended at Fontainebleau, it would merely be a tragedy. Instead, it became a myth, because less than a year later, on a gray day in March 1815, a fishing boat approached the southern coast of France. A figure stepped ashore. It was Napoleon, and he had come back to reclaim his empire, to defy the world, to write one final chapter. So the question lingers not just in history books, but in the soul of Europe. How does a man conquer the world and still lose everything? And what does it mean that even in defeat, his shadow would outlive every monarch who opposed him? If you enjoyed this journey into the echoes of empire, subscribe to Legacy Files, where history breathes, bleeds, and remembers.